That vibration shouldn't be there." The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the steady whump of the rotor blades slicing through the late morning air, but the old man said them with the calm certainty of someone who had listened to machines longer than most of the young airmen on the flight line had been alive. The UH-60 sat under the bright Texas sun, its matte gray fuselage reflecting waves of heat rising from the tarmac, and around it a cluster of technicians in crisp coveralls leaned over tablets and diagnostic screens that glowed green with flawless readings. Everything said the helicopter was fine, yet the aircraft hummed with a subtle uneven rhythm that only the old man seemed to notice. He stood about 20 yards away, hands resting loosely in the pockets of a faded olive field jacket that looked decades older than the polished hangers behind him. The jacket was worn thin at the elbows, its fabric softened by years of wind and sun, and one sleeve carried a faint outline where a patch had once been stitched and removed, leaving behind only ghost threads and a barely visible scar in the cloth. A young lieutenant named Ryan Cooper noticed him first, his brow tightening as he walked across the painted yellow lines with the brisk confidence of someone freshly assigned to command. "Sir, this is a restricted maintenance zone," Cooper said, his tone polite but edged with impatience. "Visitors aren't allowed on the line." The old man didn't move. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the spinning rotor, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something the computers couldn't hear. "She's running rough," he repeated quietly. One of the technicians snorted, glancing over his shoulder. "Running rough?" "Diagnostics are clean," the technician said, tapping his tablet. "All green across the board." Another airman stepped closer, his gaze dropping to the old jacket. "Look at that thing," he muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. "You planning to fix it with that museum piece, sir?" A few of them chuckled, the laughter light but unmistakably dismissive. The old man finally shifted his gaze from the helicopter to the group, his expression calm and unreadable, as if the mockery passed through him without leaving a mark. The wind tugged gently at the loose edges of his jacket, revealing a faint crease across the chest where something heavier had once rested. "Just sounds off," he said. Lieutenant Cooper crossed his arms, glancing from the helicopter to the old man again. "We've got certified mechanics and real-time diagnostics, sir. I think we're covered." Another airman walked past, brushing close enough to flick the edge of the jacket with 2 fingers. "Vietnam surplus," he joked. "Or Halloween costume." The group laughed again, louder this time, and the sound seemed to ripple across the open flight line. The helicopter continued its steady rotation, the blades cutting shadows across the ground in slow, sweeping arcs. The old man turned slightly, just enough to watch the rotor disc from a different angle, his posture relaxed but grounded, the kind of stillness that comes from long experience rather than hesitation. The sun glinted off the cockpit glass, and for a brief moment, the rhythmic hum of the engine dipped ever so slightly before returning to its uneven cadence. The old man's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "There," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, and though no one around him seemed to notice, the quiet certainty in his voice lingered in the hot air, as if the helicopter itself had heard him. The technicians returned their attention to their screens, but the old man remained where he stood, his eyes following the slow rotation of the blades as if reading a language written in motion and vibration rather than numbers and charts. The heat shimmer rising from the concrete blurred the edges of the helicopter, and the rhythmic pulse of the engine settled into a steady pattern that most would call normal, yet there was a faint hesitation every few seconds, subtle enough to disappear beneath the hum of machinery and distant ground vehicles. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper shifted his weight, glancing again at the worn jacket, and the longer he looked, the more the garment seemed out of place among the polished uniforms and modern equipment. The fabric carried the quiet dignity of age, the kind that did not try to impress, and the sunlight revealed faint stitching lines along the shoulder where an old unit patch had once been carefully removed. One of the younger airmen stepped closer again, curiosity replacing amusement, and he tilted his head toward the jacket. "You served, sir?" he asked, though the tone still carried a trace of skepticism. The old man nodded once, a small movement that seemed almost reluctant, then returned his attention to the helicopter. "Long time ago," he said, his voice steady and calm. The airman glanced at Lieutenant Cooper, who gave a faint shrug, and the group exchanged looks that mixed uncertainty with lingering dismissal. Another technician tapped his tablet again and spoke with confidence. Engine vibration levels are well within tolerance. Nothing to worry about. The old man took a slow step forward, his boots making a soft scraping sound against the sun-warmed concrete, and he paused just inside the painted boundary line. He did not touch the aircraft, did not reach for any panel or component, but his gaze moved across the rotor mast, then along the tail boom, and finally toward the engine housing where the sunlight flickered against the metal surface. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, and somehow familiar, like someone revisiting a place he had known decades before. Lieutenant Cooper noticed the shift and felt a faint, unexpected unease. There was something about the way the old man watched the helicopter that did not match a casual observer. It was not curiosity. It was recognition. The wind shifted across the open flight line, carrying the smell of fuel and warm metal, and the rotor blades cast long shadows that swept across the ground in steady intervals. The old man tilted his head slightly again, listening, and his eyes narrowed as the faint hesitation returned, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to him. "Listen to that," he said quietly, though no one else reacted. One of the technicians folded his arms and gave a half smile. "I hear a perfectly healthy engine." The old man nodded gently, as if acknowledging the confidence, and his gaze softened for a moment, not with disagreement, but with patience. He had heard this before, the certainty of numbers, the faith in screens, the belief that experience could be replaced by diagnostics. The helicopter continued to idle, steady and powerful, yet the old man's stillness seemed to anchor the scene, as if time slowed slightly around him. Lieutenant Cooper shifted again, glancing from the helicopter to the old man, and though he could not explain why, the faintest feeling of doubt crept into his thoughts, carried on the warm breeze and the quiet certainty of a man in an old jacket who listened to machines as if they were speaking directly to him. The faint hesitation in the rotor rhythm came again, subtle but persistent, and this time the old man took another step forward, stopping just short of the aircraft's shadow as it swept slowly across the tarmac. The sunlight caught the worn seams of his jacket, and for a brief moment the faded fabric seemed to carry more history than the polished machines around him. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper noticed the movement and followed the old man's gaze, but all he saw was a perfectly operating helicopter and a team of confident technicians who had already cleared the aircraft for demonstration. One of the airmen glanced over again, his expression shifting from amusement to mild irritation. "Sir, we really have this under control," he said, tapping the side of his headset as if reinforcing his authority. The old man nodded once, not in agreement but in quiet acknowledgement, and his eyes tracked the rotor hub again, measuring the motion with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that machines revealed their secrets only to those willing to wait. A gust of warm wind crossed the flight line, carrying the distant sound of another helicopter taxiing half a mile away, and the overlapping rhythms created a brief moment of acoustic distortion that made the subtle vibration easier to hear. The old man tilted his head slightly, and the corners of his eyes tightened as recognition settled deeper. "There is a harmonic shift every 6 seconds, he said softly, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. The technicians exchanged glances, and one of them shook his head with a faint smile. "All readings are stable," he replied, scrolling through diagnostic data. "No harmonic issues." Lieutenant Cooper folded his arms again, but his confidence was no longer absolute. There was something about the way the old man spoke that did not sound like guessing. It sounded like memory. The old man moved his gaze along the aircraft again, from the rotor mast to the engine housing, then toward the tail rotor, as if mapping the vibration through experience rather than instruments. The sun reflected off the cockpit glass, and the slow rotation of the blades cast moving shadows across his boots. He remained still, grounded, listening. Another technician walked past and glanced at the jacket again, noticing the faint outline where the patch had once been. "You flew helicopters?" he asked, more curious now than mocking. The old man paused before answering, and for a moment his expression softened with distant recollection. "Sometimes," he said quietly. The answer was simple, but it carried a weight that made the airman hesitate. Lieutenant Cooper watched the exchange, and a subtle tension settled in his posture. The old man's stillness no longer seemed passive. It felt deliberate, like a man measuring time in ways others could not see. The rotor blades continued their steady sweep, and once again the faint hesitation passed through the rhythm, subtle but unmistakable. The old man nodded slightly to himself, as if confirming something long suspected, and his eyes lifted toward the cockpit, where the pilot waited for clearance. The warmth of the late morning sun pressed down across the flight line, and for a moment everything seemed suspended between certainty and doubt, with the quiet figure in the worn jacket standing at the center of it, listening to a machine that seemed to speak only to him. The faint doubt that had begun to settle over Lieutenant Ryan Cooper deepened as he watched the old man remain perfectly still, as if the motion of the helicopter meant more to him than the data scrolling across the technician's screens. The rotor blades continued their measured rotation, cutting through the warm air with a steady rhythm that most would call flawless, yet every few seconds there was that nearly invisible shift, like a heartbeat slightly out of time. The old man took another slow step, his boots crossing into the edge of the aircraft's shadow, and he studied the tailboom with quiet focus. The wind tugged lightly at the faded edges of his jacket, revealing a small stitched repair near the pocket, the kind done carefully by hand years ago. One of the technicians noticed the movement and let out a soft chuckle, though it lacked the confidence from earlier. "You sure you are not hearing ghosts, sir?" he asked, folding his arms. The old man did not react to the comment. Instead, he shifted his gaze toward the landing gear, then back toward the rotor hub, his eyes narrowing slightly as the faint hesitation returned. "Tail rotor compensation is lagging," he said quietly, almost as if he were thinking aloud. The technician frowned and glanced at his tablet again. "All response times are normal," he replied, though his voice carried less certainty now. Lieutenant Cooper followed the exchange, and for the first time he noticed something else. The old man was not watching randomly. His eyes moved in a deliberate pattern, checking the same points each time the rhythm shifted, as if tracing a familiar sequence learned long ago. The pilot inside the cockpit adjusted slightly, and the engine pitch changed just enough to make the vibration more noticeable. The old man nodded faintly, confirming what he had already sensed. "She is compensating too hard," he murmured. Another airman stepped closer, curiosity now stronger than skepticism. "You used to maintain these?" he asked carefully. The old man paused again, and for a moment the sunlight reflected in his eyes, revealing a depth shaped by years that could not be measured. "Sometimes I kept them flying," he said softly. The answer hung in the air, simple but weighted with quiet confidence. Lieutenant Cooper felt the shift in tone ripple across the group. The earlier laughter had faded, replaced by an unspoken tension that none of them acknowledged directly. The helicopter continued its steady idle, but now the faint hesitation seemed more noticeable, as if once heard it could not be ignored. The old man lifted his gaze toward the horizon briefly, then back to the aircraft, listening again with the patience of someone who trusted instinct as much as technology. A light breeze crossed the runway, carrying the distant rumble of ground vehicles and the smell of warm metal. The old man remained composed, his presence calm but grounded, and the worn jacket moved slightly with the wind, the faded fabric whispering against itself. Lieutenant Cooper shifted again, and for the first time he felt the uncomfortable possibility that the quiet figure in front of him understood the machine better than the entire team standing beside him. The rotor blade swept overhead again, and the old man's eyes sharpened as the subtle hesitation returned, steady and undeniable, like a quiet signal waiting for someone experienced enough to recognize it. The silence around the helicopter began to change, not dramatically, but in the subtle way that happens when confidence gives way to curiosity. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper watched the old man carefully now, noticing how his gaze followed the rotor arc with quiet precision, then shifted toward the engine housing at the exact moment the faint hesitation returned. The pattern repeated again, and this time even one of the technicians lowered his tablet slightly, as if listening instead of relying on numbers. The sun continued to press down on the flight line, and the heat shimmer made the aircraft appear almost suspended in the air. The old man moved one step closer, still outside the marked boundary, and the breeze lifted the corner of his jacket again, revealing a small metal zipper pull worn smooth by decades of use. He studied the aircraft with a calm focus that felt out of place among the modern equipment and crisp uniforms. "There is a delay in the stabilizer response," he said quietly, his voice measured and calm. One of the technicians hesitated before answering, glancing at his data again. "The system is compensating automatically," he replied, though the certainty had faded from his tone. The old man nodded slightly, as if he expected the answer, and his eyes returned to the tail rotor assembly. The faint vibration passed through again, and this time Lieutenant Cooper felt it too, not as clearly as the old man, but enough to register as something unusual. The pilot inside the cockpit adjusted throttle slightly, and the pitch shifted for a moment before settling back into its uneven rhythm. The old man exhaled slowly, a quiet breath that carried recognition rather than surprise. "She is working harder than she should," he murmured. One of the younger airmen glanced at the jacket again, noticing the faint stitching near the shoulder. "You flew these during training?" he asked cautiously. The old man paused, and for a brief moment his eyes reflected something distant, like memory rising quietly to the surface. "Sometimes I brought them home," he said softly. The words were simple, but the tone carried a quiet weight that lingered in the warm air. Lieutenant Cooper shifted his stance, feeling the atmosphere shift again. The earlier laughter had vanished completely, replaced by a quiet tension that settled over the group. The helicopter continued its steady idle, and once again the faint hesitation returned, subtle but unmistakable now that they were listening for it. The old man remained calm, his presence steady, and the worn jacket moved gently in the breeze, the faded fabric whispering softly against itself. The technicians exchanged glances, uncertain but attentive, and Lieutenant Cooper realized that the quiet figure in front of them was no longer just an outsider in an old jacket, but someone who seemed to understand the aircraft in a way that did not require screens or diagnostics. The rotor blade swept overhead again, and the old man's eyes sharpened slightly, confirming what he had sensed all along, while the warm Texas air carried the growing silence across the flight line, as if the helicopter itself was waiting for someone who remembered how to listen. The rotor blades continued their slow rotation, cutting through the warm air with a steady rhythm that now felt less certain than before, and the subtle hesitation returned again, faint but persistent, like a quiet signal repeating itself beneath the surface. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper felt it more clearly this time. Not through the vibration under his boots, but through the stillness of the old man, who seemed to anticipate each shift before it happened. The worn jacket moved gently in the breeze, and the sunlight caught the faded fabric, revealing faint creases shaped by years of use. The old man's eyes moved from the rotor mast to the tail boom again, then toward the engine housing, tracing the same deliberate path he had followed before. One of the technicians lowered his tablet completely now, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "You think it is the stabilizer actuator?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. The old man tilted his head slightly, listening again as the faint hesitation returned, and he nodded once, slowly. "Not failing," he said calmly. "Just compensating too late." The technician frowned, glancing toward the cockpit, and the pilot adjusted the throttle slightly, causing the engine pitch to rise for a moment before settling again. The vibration shifted briefly, then returned to its uneven cadence. The old man watched carefully, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharpened as if confirming something deeper. Lieutenant Cooper felt the tension building across the group, the earlier confidence replaced by a quiet uncertainty that spread without anyone acknowledging it directly. The warm air shimmered above the tarmac, and the helicopter seemed suspended in that shimmering heat, its motion steady but no longer unquestioned. The old man took another slow step forward, still respecting the boundary line, and the breeze lifted the collar of his jacket, revealing a faint discoloration along the neckline where years of sun had faded the fabric unevenly. His presence remained calm, grounded, and deliberate, and the silence around him grew heavier with each passing second. Another airman shifted his stance and spoke carefully. "You worked maintenance back then?" he asked, his voice no longer skeptical, but curious. The old man paused, his gaze still fixed on the aircraft, and for a moment his expression softened with distant memory. "Sometimes," he said quietly. The answer was simple, but the tone carried experience that could not be measured by certifications or screens. Lieutenant Cooper noticed how the technicians were now listening, their posture subtly changed, their attention divided between their data and the quiet figure in the worn jacket. The rotor blade swept overhead again, and the faint hesitation returned, undeniable now that they were listening for it. The old man nodded faintly to himself, as if confirming a familiar pattern, and he lifted his gaze toward the cockpit once more. The pilot waited, hand steady, unaware of the silent conversation unfolding below. The warm Texas sun pressed down on the flight line, and the distant rumble of another aircraft echoed faintly across the base. The old man remained still, listening with quiet certainty, and Lieutenant Cooper realized that the calm figure beside the helicopter was no longer an outsider observing a machine, but someone who seemed to understand it in a way that felt older than the aircraft itself, as if the rhythm of the rotor spoke to him in a language the rest of them were only just beginning to hear. The faint hesitation returned again, and this time it lingered just long enough for everyone on the flight line to feel it, not as a vibration underfoot but as a subtle disruption in the steady rhythm they had trusted moments earlier. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper shifted his stance, his eyes moving instinctively toward the old man before returning to the helicopter, and the connection between the two felt impossible to ignore. The worn jacket stirred lightly in the warm breeze, and the sunlight revealed another detail along the sleeve, a thin line of stitching where something once secured had been carefully removed. The old man stood quietly, his posture relaxed but grounded, his gaze locked on the rotor disc as it carved slow circles through the shimmering air. One of the technicians leaned slightly closer to the aircraft, listening now instead of watching numbers, and the silence between them deepened as the engine pitch dipped again for a fraction of a second. "There," the old man said softly, his voice calm and certain. The technician nodded faintly, no longer dismissing the observation. Lieutenant Cooper felt the shift ripple through the group, the earlier confidence replaced by quiet attention, and the helicopter seemed to respond to that silence, its motion steady but no longer unquestioned. The old man's eyes moved again in the same deliberate pattern, rotor mast, engine housing, tail boom, and back again, as if confirming each piece of a familiar puzzle. A light gust crossed the runway, carrying the distant sound of another aircraft lifting off somewhere beyond the hangars, and the overlapping rhythms briefly amplified the uneven cadence. The old man's expression tightened slightly, and he nodded once more, confirming what he had already sensed. One of the younger airmen swallowed quietly and glanced at Lieutenant Cooper. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Cooper hesitated before answering, then gave a slight nod. The hesitation was subtle, but now that they were listening, it was impossible to ignore. The old man remained still, calm, and patient, as if waiting for the machine to reveal its story completely. Another technician shifted his weight and spoke carefully. "If you are right, it could be the compensator reacting to a delayed input," he said, almost thinking aloud. The old man did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the rotor sweep overhead again, then lowered his gaze toward the landing gear, tracing the vibration as if mapping it through memory rather than instrumentation. "She is correcting twice," he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. The technician frowned, then glanced back at his tablet, scrolling through readings that suddenly felt less definitive. Lieutenant Cooper noticed how the group had drawn slightly closer together, not physically, but in attention, their focus unified by the calm certainty of the man in the worn jacket. The warm Texas air pressed down on the flight line, and the distant hum of base activity faded into the background as the helicopter's rhythm took center stage. The old man lifted his eyes toward the cockpit again, his calm presence anchoring the moment, and the faint hesitation returned once more, undeniable now, like a quiet signal repeating itself until someone experienced enough understood what it meant. The hesitation in the rotor rhythm came again, and this time it was no longer subtle enough to dismiss as imagination. The faint shift echoed across the warm air, and even the pilot inside the cockpit adjusted slightly, as if sensing something that the instruments had not yet identified. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper felt the change ripple through the group, and the quiet confidence that had once defined the flight line had now been replaced by careful attention. The old man remained still, his eyes following the rotor disc as it swept overhead, then shifting toward the engine housing with the same deliberate focus he had shown from the beginning. The breeze lifted the edge of his jacket again, and the sunlight revealed a faint crease across the chest where something heavy had once rested for years. One of the technicians leaned closer, listening now with intent rather than skepticism, and when the faint hesitation returned, he glanced immediately toward the old man. The calm certainty in the old man's posture had begun to shape the atmosphere around them, and the helicopter seemed almost to respond to that silence, its rhythm steady but strained in a way that felt increasingly obvious. "She is correcting twice," the old man repeated softly, his voice measured and calm. The technician nodded slowly, scrolling through the diagnostic data, his brow tightening as he searched for confirmation that the numbers did not immediately provide. Lieutenant Cooper stepped slightly closer, his earlier authority replaced by quiet observation, and he followed the old man's gaze along the aircraft. The sun shimmered across the tarmac, and the sweeping shadows of the rotor blades passed over their boots in steady intervals. Another faint dip in engine pitch followed, brief but unmistakable, and the technician exhaled slowly as if realizing that the pattern was now undeniable. The old man tilted his head slightly, listening again, then lifted his eyes toward the cockpit. The pilot waited, hand steady on the controls, unaware of the silent realization unfolding below. The warm Texas air carried distant bass activity, but on the flight line the sound of the helicopter dominated, and each subtle shift now felt amplified by the quiet tension. One of the younger airmen glanced at the old jacket again, noticing how naturally the man stood beside the aircraft, not as a visitor but as someone who belonged in that environment. The faint hesitation returned once more, and the technician beside Lieutenant Cooper lowered his tablet completely, no longer trusting the data alone. If the compensator is lagging, he said carefully, it would not show immediately. The old man gave a slight nod, his expression unchanged, as if the conclusion had been clear long before anyone else had begun to listen. The rotor blade swept overhead again, and the subtle shift returned, steady and unmistakable, and in that moment the quiet figure in the worn jacket seemed less like an observer and more like the only person on the flight line who had heard the aircraft asking for attention before anyone else realized something was wrong. The faint hesitation returned once more, and this time Lieutenant Ryan Cooper raised his hand slightly toward the cockpit, signaling the pilot to hold position. The rotor blades continued their slow rotation, but the atmosphere on the flight line had changed completely. No one laughed anymore. No one checked their tablets with the same confidence. Every set of eyes drifted toward the quiet figure in the worn jacket, who stood calmly with his gaze fixed on the aircraft as if the machine were speaking directly to him. The warm Texas sun reflected across the cockpit glass, and the pilot eased the throttle slightly, allowing the engine pitch to settle into a lower idle. The subtle vibration became easier to hear, and when the faint hesitation returned again, it was unmistakable. One of the technicians exhaled slowly. "There it is," he said under his breath. The old man gave a small nod, not with satisfaction, but with quiet recognition, as if he had expected this moment from the beginning. Lieutenant Cooper stepped forward, his earlier authority replaced by careful respect. "Pilot, hold idle," he called, his voice steady but measured. The rotor slowed slightly, and the helicopter settled into a calmer rhythm. The technician moved closer to the tail boom, scanning visually now instead of trusting data alone. A moment passed, then another, and finally the technician looked back, his expression serious. "Compensator lag," he said quietly. "It is subtle, but it is there." The realization spread across the group, and the silence deepened. Lieutenant Cooper turned slowly toward the old man, studying him more carefully now. The faded jacket, the quiet posture, the calm certainty, everything felt different in the new light of understanding. Before Cooper could speak, the distant sound of a vehicle approached, rolling steadily across the concrete. A dark staff vehicle pulled up along the edge of the flight line, and the door opened smoothly. Colonel Michael Harrington stepped out, his uniform crisp, his posture composed, and his eyes immediately scanning the aircraft before drifting toward the group gathered nearby. The technician straightened instinctively, and Lieutenant Cooper moved to brief him, but the colonel's attention had already shifted. His gaze stopped on the old man in the worn jacket. For a moment, the colonel did not speak. The breeze moved gently across the flight line, and the sunlight caught the faded fabric of the jacket, revealing the faint outline of where a unit patch had once been stitched. The colonel's expression changed subtly, recognition flickering across his face. He took a slow step forward, his eyes fixed on the old man, and the silence around them grew heavier with each second. The rotor blades continued their slow sweep overhead, and the warm air seemed to hold still. Then the colonel spoke, his voice quiet but unmistakable. "Reaper 1. The old man turned slightly, meeting the colonel's gaze with calm familiarity, and gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a name that had not been spoken in years. The technicians exchanged stunned glances, and Lieutenant Cooper felt the moment settle across the flight line like a sudden shift in gravity. Colonel Harrington straightened and brought his hand up in a precise salute, his movement deliberate and respectful. The old man returned the gesture slowly, and the entire group followed instinctively, the silence complete except for the steady hum of the helicopter. The warm Texas wind moved across the runway, and the faded jacket shifted gently, no longer just an old piece of fabric, but a quiet reminder that some experience does not fade, and some names are remembered long after they are spoken for the last time.